This is my student ID card. My name is Yusuf Raji Ononno. Good morning, Magan. I have reviewed the materials relating to the Dylan Sarder. I will advise on potential criminal liability arising from three incidents: the warehouse entry, the injury to Pranav, and the watch in the pub. I will address is using the IDEX structure, including definition, application, and any possible defenses. The first issue is whether Dylan is liable for burglary under the Section 9, subsection 1 and subsection A of the Theft Act 1968. Burglary under the Section 9, subsection 1, subsection A is committed where a person enters a building or a part of a building as a trespasser with intent to commit theft, grievous bodily harm, or criminal damage. The actus reus required entry of a building or part of a building as a trespasser. Entry can be minimal, as in R versus Ryan. A person become a trespasser if they enter without permission or exceed the scope of permission, as in R versus Jones and Smith. The mens rea requires knowledge or recklessness as to trespass, and intention at the time of entry to commit one of the offences listed in Section 9, subsection 2. Importantly, burglary is complete at the point of entry. So, Dylan entered the warehouse using his key, so entry into a building is clearly satisfied. The key is issue is whether he was trespasser. Although he had permission as an employee, this was limited as to work purpose. Dylan entered with a crowbar and said he wanted to teach a Marlon a lesson. So, applying Jones and Smith, he exceeded the scope of his permission and it therefore likely to be a trespasser. In terms of mens rea, the coward suggests that at the time of entry, he intended to commit a criminal damage. There is an argument that uh, his intent was unclear, but the presence of the coward makes it likely that court would like to interpret the necessary intent. So, the stage of defense, Dylan may argue he had permission to enter, but this was limited and clearly exceeded. He may also argue lack of intent, but the cowbird suggests the preparation, so defense is weak here. In conclusion, for this incident, Dylan is likely for burglary under the Section 9, subsection 1, subsection A. This could alternatively amount to attempts to criminal damage. Now, the second issue about the Pranav Sa. The second issue is whether Dylan is liable under the Section 20 of the Offence Against the Person Act 1861. Section 20 is committed where a person unlawfully and maliciously inflict grievous bodily harm, meaning really serious harm. Grievous bodily harm means really serious harm, as in R versus Sanders. The seriousness of harm can take into account the victim's characterized as in R versus Bloom. Inflict simply means to cause harm, as confirmed in R versus Wilson. The measure requires intention or recklessness as to some harm, not serious harm, as in R versus Savage. So, Pranav suffered a fracture collarbone and nerve damage and required surgery. This is clearly amount to serious harm and satisfied grievous bodily harm. Solution in satisfaction because Thailand pulled him backward, causing the injury. So Pranav had a bone condition, make him more vulnerable. However, this does not assist Dylan as the harm is ascent as it occurred. In terms of Mensria, Dylan says he was messing around. However, pulling someone forcefully creates a risk of injury. So Dylan was at least recklessness as the causation of some harm. So in the defense, in this incident, Dylan may argue that Pranav consists because they were discussing MMA. However, this was informed and took place in a pub. The level of injury was serious, so consent is unlikely to apply. So there is lack of intent. Thailand did not intend serious harm, but this is irrelevant as only recklessness as to some harm is required. So in this conclusion, Thailand is likely liable under the Section 20. This could alternatively amount to Section 47. The final issue is whether Dylan is liable for a theft under the Section 1, Subsection 1 of the Theft Act 1968. Theft is defined as dishonest appropriation of property belonging to another with the intention of permanently deprive to other of it. So, appropriation means any assumption of the rights of the owner as in R versus Morris. It can occur even with consent, as in R versus Gomez and R versus Hinks. Property include personal items. Property belongs to another if they have possession or control. Lost property is abandoned, as William versus Phillips. Dishonesty is assent using Ivey versus Genting Casino. So, Dylan picked up the watch and placed into his pocket, which is appropriation. The watch is property and belongs to another. It was not abandoned as it was under a chair in a pub. The key issue is dishonesty. Dylan may argue he thought it was abandoned, but the circumstance and the aggressiveness response suggest otherwise. So, applying IV, ordinary people would likely consider his conduct dishonest. He intended to permanently deprive the owner as the keep the watch. So, in this incident, at the level of defense, Tyler may argue belief in abandoned or honest belief in a right of the property. However, both are weak based on the fact and his conduct. So, in the conclusion for this incident, Dylan is likely liable for theft. His behavior could also amount to public order offense. For overall conclusion, Dylan is likely liable for burglary and Section 20 grievous bodily harm and theft. Although there are possible defenses, they are likely to succeed. So that would be my advice. Thank you for today.